Hello everyone, welcome to the presentation of Gently Used to Irreparably Broken by Dean Young. We'll be starting in just a few moments as we give people some time to attend. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the Q&A during the event, and we'll have time for questions at the end as well. Just a few moments before we begin. Hello everyone, welcome to the presentation Gently Used and Irreparably Broken. We're going to have our speaker, Dean Young, who's one of our Justice Studies instructors, speak in just a moment. During the presentation, you're free to write into the question and answer field, and the questions may be answered during the presentation or at a discussion time near the end. At any time, if you have any immediate questions, please feel free to send the questions to us, and we'll be happy to get to them. But let me introduce to you Dean Young, our guest speaker for the day. Dean, the floor is yours. Your mic's muted, Dean. Still muted, Dean. Good to go.
Okay, I'm good to go. Look at that, we just starting and we're already, I'm already messing this up. So thanks, Scott. As Scott mentioned, my name is Dean Young. I'm an instructor here at Bow Valley College in the Justice Studies program. As well, I am a peace officer here in Alberta. and I'm here to present to you my presentation on Gently Used to Irreparably Broken, a personal view of first responder mental health and occupational stress injuries. Before we start, I would like to play our land acknowledgement for where Calgary and Bow Valley College lay on traditional lands of the Siksika people, and I will have that land acknowledgement played here by Noella Wells.
Dean, your sound's not sharing. Can you restart that, please?
Sorry, everybody. We've lost the sound. Allow me to do this once again.
Bow Valley College is located in the traditional territories of the Niitsitapi, Blackfoot, and the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, and the Eyahe Nakota. We are situated on land where the Bow River meets the Elbow River, and the traditional Blackfoot name of this place is Mohkinstsis, which we now call the City of Calgary. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3.
Okay, thank you for that. Let me just change over some of my screens here, and we will get going here. Okay, perfect. So let's get this show rolling here. So once again, this particular presentation is based upon my own experiences as a first responder. As well, I'm going to share the stories of two of my friends who are fellow first responders and the experiences they've had in their careers as well. So let's set out some ground rules here first and foremost. Some of the content that we're going to be talking about here today is going to be somewhat emotional. Part of that will be emotional for me, so I have my Kleenex sitting here just all ready to go. I tried to get all of my emotions out over the last couple of days so I could get through this presentation. But I do understand that you know, some of these stories, and I really will spare the gorier of the details and kind of soften some of this stuff. But I want to make sure that you guys know that you're perfectly well within your own rights to take care of your own needs, and I would highly recommend that your own needs are very important at this point. So if you find yourselves triggered by any of the information that I have to share here today, please tend to yourself. If you have to leave the room, do so. If you have to get up and walk around, whatever you need, just make sure that this doesn't cause any particular problems for you, or at least minimize that. So I want to talk a little bit about what I'm not before I start talking about what I am. What I am not is an expert. I'm also not a psychologist. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a scientist. All I am is a guy that has a ton of lived experience to share. I've been in this business for over 20 years. bouncing between various different services. I was a firefighter, I was a peace officer, I spent my first early years in security, and just have had a wealth of experiences that definitely built me up in many ways professionally. But we're here to talk about, unfortunately, the trauma that can come from those experiences. So what I am, really, I'm just a man who started out with a desire to pursue public safety career. So I started out in security, low pay, a not very well regarded industry, as anybody here today that works in the security industry will be able to agree with. But I pushed through, striving to improve my professional skills. My goals were more laying with a policing career, so I went into the security industry to become a police officer and get the requisite skills, kind of break down some of my own fears and my own challenges. So moving on, I then decided to volunteer with my local fire department, and I got a true taste of what the life of a first responder has to offer. The camaraderie, the self-development, the satisfaction. Unfortunately, this is where the path started for me to build up a significant serving of traumatic experiences. And that's, again, here we see me today and what I've become because of those traumatic experiences. And as if I wasn't enough of a glutton for punishment, I continued on the path and broke into the law enforcement arena where traffic duties were a primary role. So heaping yet more traumatic experiences in my day-to-day professional career. And so all of this was done in the name of public safety and caring for my community. Who I am deeper, I am a member of a team, always. All of my career, I've been part of a team, sometimes large, sometimes small, but I can't imagine ever working alone. Thankfully, it's the team that has provided me with the most at-work support through all of my troubles. The two fine gentlemen you see standing with me there at the Alberta Police and Peace Officer Memorial Pillar of Strength Monument are my current team and with whom I've served for the past 7 years. And they are shining examples of what a team can do for a suffering member. You will find that if you are part of a professional, empathetic team, you will find half of your path during traumatic experiences or episodes, you will find them to be the post to lean on. But who I am even deeper, I'm a husband and I'm a lifelong partner. And as a matter of fact, my wife is just sitting over here listening to me talk. So I will watch what I'm saying. This is an example of one of the smaller teams that I mentioned earlier. Lisa and I have been together for about 26 years and have been married for 23 of them. She's the foundation of my support network, and I truly consider her my savior. I truly consider her my savior. Marital breakdown is one of the most common casualties in a first responder career, and I'd recommend that you engage your significant other and embrace whatever support they can offer as you go forward in your careers, be that policing, fire, paramedicine, social work, child welfare, any career path that you are on right now. If you are working alone or if you aren't working on a team that supports your needs, your significant other is the person that spends the most time with you outside of work. So, there's a lot of value judgments based on relationship matters in the first responder community, and I'm not here to discuss that. But what I would do is I would encourage you to focus and take effort to maintain your marital status when you're in this job, because the job can eat you up and spit you out. And the person that is there with you, your significant other, your spouse, your partner, they're the ones that can be saviors for you. I would highly encourage you to tend a positive domestic relationship if that's what you can do. Who I am even deeper, I'm a father, I'm a son, I'm an uncle. And this highlights the sheer power that family can exercise with respect to support when they understand the issues going on in your career. A traditional take on policing, for example, is that, you know, don't bring your work home. You know, you bring your work home, you bring that stress home, you stress out your spouse, you stress out your family. You know, you don't want to share the gory details of what's happened. You don't want to share how upset you are, how sad you are for the things that you've done. But we're showing that that's a problem. That's a problem when you're not communicating with your life partner. Obviously, there is vicarious liability, or sorry, not liability, vicarious trauma. And that's definitely a realistic thing as well. And we need to be careful about how we're communicating with our family members, especially the children. But the fact of the matter is, we're going to address how secrets can kill us. And in fact, if we're only being able to share our feelings and sharing our tribulations with those people that are working in the environment with us, then we get a lot of confirmation bias. Right? We either get a lot of confirmation bias where somebody, your partner or, you know, your coworkers are saying, you know, yeah, you're absolutely right. You know, we're not going to give you any other kind of perspective on this because we're going through the same thing and you're absolutely right. Well, sometimes these things need to be challenged, right? We can be challenged if we can share what our thoughts are, share what our feelings are with our family members, and they can tell us, well, you're full of BS, because that's not in fact how it is. Really, you're seeing the negative, and I'm speaking 100% from my own experience now. You're just seeing the negative. You're focusing on the negative and you're totally ignoring the positive. So that's what family can do for us. It can add perspective. And if we don't share with our family, if we don't communicate, we don't get that other side. We don't get that grounding that family can produce. So who am I at the deepest level? At this point in my life, I am a work in progress. I continue to be a work in progress, and I will continue forward for the remainder of my life. I'm constantly having to be on guard against wear and tear, and I work on growth and resilience. I'm a bit of a hypocrite here when I'm talking about how, you know, you have to grow and do all these things, and I continue to struggle. I struggle with these things. So before we begin on my personal journey, let me ask you a question. How are these two photos any different? You know, just as you would expect if you went down on a call, you would want help. So why should it be any different if it's an injury of the mind instead of just your injured body? So the picture of the firefighter here, here's a professional who's obviously injured. He's on a stretcher. He's got an oxygen mask on. He's got a bandage around his hand. Yet, what does he have here? He's being transported to advanced care. He has two other members that are working on stabilizing him, treating his injuries, and get him to where he needs to be for his own advanced medical care. But what about the other picture? Here's another first responder, alone, isolated at home, and suffering in private. So how are these any different? I would put it to you this way. In these pictures, right, the injured member is surrounded, not just by two people. He's surrounded by emergency care workers, probably teammates, working to keep him alive. You look at the passion in the faces of those teammates, you know? And yet, once again, you look at the other first responder. What about him? What about this man who is alone and suffering in silence? Who's fighting to keep him alive? Well, depends on who we've surrounded ourselves by. And we're going to look further into that. So let's explore what may lead a first responder into that aloneness, into that isolation and that silent suffering. So before I go on, I want to make sure that everybody here understands that some of the photos I'm going to be showing here are quite graphic, and that the narratives in this part of the presentation are going to be somewhat detailed. I won't be sharing the very goriest of the details, but it's important for me to paint a picture of the sheer terrible things that I've lived during my participation in these events in the aftermath. I'm also going to apologize in advance. I work on not using foul language. I have a tendency to swear a lot, and I will work on making sure that my language is audience clean. So in my career, I've attended calls for service both as a firefighter and a peace officer. And in many of these calls, I've been the primary responder. The first call that I remember when I joined the fire department was a 3-year-old boy who had his arm caught in an industrial auger on a farm. So this was the first time I'd actually seen stars up close and personal. But the fact of the matter is the patient was a 3-year-old boy. And at that time, my oldest daughter was about the same age. But you know what? Didn't bother me. Or did it? I remember coming away from the experience thinking, well, you know what? The kid's fine. That's awesome. You know, I got to see stars. That was awesome. Got to land it. That was pretty cool. You know, I was caught up in the adrenaline of the situation itself. I never really seriously and consciously gave any thought to the fact that this was a 3-year-old child who was in significant amounts of pain, and the fact that my own child could have been that kid. But like I said, didn't bother me. Sorry, I'm having troubles here trying to, there we go, okay. So my first fatality was a single vehicle collision that was being driven by an impaired driver. So the driver was ejected of the vehicle and the vehicle came to rest on top of her body. I am going to spare you those gory details. But interestingly enough, when I first moved to where I live now, I actually met and befriended the daughter of that victim. And she had actually grown up to join the local fire department, the fire department that I was part of, because of this particular incident. Again, didn't bother me. My next memorable call was a vehicle fire in which the driver, who was suspected to be impaired, burned while he collided with a ditch. Once again, I'll spare you the gory details, but let's just say that I can still remember the smell that was surrounding that car. The first real impactful call that I remember was a vehicle rollover, and the photo on the screen here is actually the photo that was taken on scene. You know, it was the first deceased person I'd ever touched, and he was unfortunately a 17-year-old young man whose only fault that day was not wearing a seatbelt. I remember that call vividly, and as I remember it now, I can tell you that I could tell this story minute to minute to minute, from beginning to end, because I was the first responder on scene. I remember running past that vehicle that you see there. I remember hearing the one conscious passenger screaming. And I ran past the vehicle because there was 3 people in the field approximately 30 meters away from this car that appeared to be doing first aid and CPR. Because I had the AED with me, I ran over to that particular spot. I cleared the 2 responders that were doing CPR, and I assessed the patient. That was the 17-year-old boy. And he was dead. He had no pulse. So one of the persons doing CPR was an off-duty firefighter from another municipality, and he was good to continue. So I let them continue doing CPR, and I went back to this car. So for those of you in the justice stream here, you're going to learn, or you've already learned about the sensory gating that happens when in high stress situations. And one of those is tunnel vision. And I remember that this was my first real experience with tunnel vision because I didn't realize it, but I ran past this car where there was a ton of debris that I ran through, and I actually ran through a barbed wire fence. Didn't even notice it. So that particular call took quite a bit of time. We had to extract 3 patients out of the vehicle. all of which were alive, but 2 of them were unconscious. It took a long time to get them out. And one of them was so stuck in there that the paramedics were considering bringing in a field surgeon to cut his body out of the vehicle. So I remember following that, the chief, our fire chief, attended our practice. There was no debriefing, there was no critical incident stress management. It was just our chief came to our next meeting and, you know, told us how much of a good job we did. She told us that it was the most dynamic rescue she could remember in her career, and kudos went around the table. But you know, I had to drive past that spot because that was on the highway where I used to take to drive to work. So I drove by that spot every day. And in fact, I was there not that long ago, and the memorial cross is still on the fence in that area for the 17-year-old who unfortunately died. So this was a high-speed incident. And I think that this is really where I developed a sense of outrage when it comes to traffic safety. And this prompted me as well to move into the peace officer world once policing was no longer an option. And I think it still motivates me today. 17 years old. Everyone in that vehicle that survived was wearing their seatbelt. And this particular fellow tumbled 30 meters after being ejected from this vehicle as it was rolling. And he was dead. So the next very memorable incident was an actual medical call that actually occurred in the village where I lived. And the patient was a very well-known resident. And I did CPR on this fellow for 20 minutes, all the while listening to the screams of the family. We believe he'd had a stroke, and he was in the bathroom having a shower when the family heard a thump. Mom sent a teenager son into the room to check on Dad, and he found Dad lying on the floor of the bathroom. When we arrived, everybody was absolutely freaking out in this house. I had gone into the bathroom. I assessed him. I found that he had no pulse. And this is where teamwork really does play a huge role, because I remember another member coming in and doing the open airway portion for my CPR. And then we had another member, when I looked up, had the automated external defibrillator all ready for me, handing me the pads. So we had determined that he had no pulse. I had attached the automated external defibrillator, and it told me that there was no shock advised. For any of you that are AED trained, we all know what no shock advised means when it comes out of the machine. So continuing CPR, we were waiting for the ambulance. When the ambulance arrived, the paramedic ordered us to bring the person's body outside of the bathroom and into the bathroom, or sorry, into the bedroom. So as I had moved down to the legs, the paramedic took the trunk, and as he lifted the man's trunk, he aspirated all over me. Again, never really considered what was going on at that point. I wasn't paying that much attention to that piece of it. I just wanted to help move this particular fellow so we could continue working on him. So we did CPR for more time there, but I wasn't doing compressions. One of our rookies, our new members, was doing compressions, and he looked absolutely terrified. And he looked at me and he's like, "Am I doing this right?" And at the time I was a first aid and CPR instructor. So I was able to determine what he needed to do. All he needed to do was push harder. And then finally, the paramedic basically had said, "All right, everybody, stop care." And he was obviously no longer alive. So I remember helping clean up the garbage from the medical equipment. And there were a lot of people in that room, I remember. And in my mind, I was thinking that there was too many. So I decided to leave the room. And I went out to our rescue unit and I found that rookie member sitting inside all by himself. So I sat with him and we were just kind of chatting about what had happened, when another one of our members came over and mentioned that the 15-year-old boy that had done CPR on his dad prior to our arrival was just sitting out on the step alone. So I remember going over to him and talking to him, and of course he said all of the things you would expect a child to say, you know, that he was blaming himself, you know, he didn't know what to do, you know, but he did CPR, and he was doing CPR because mom, this was back before cell phones, so you can imagine how old that was yelling directions when she called 911, yelling directions from the kitchen into the far end of the house for her son to actually do the first aid. So I asked him, you know, like, tell me what you did. And he told me what he did. And I told him, like, look, I'm a first aid instructor. I'm an emergency medical responder. Right? I've done this a lot. There is nothing that you could have done differently. And if we, with our advanced skills and our advanced equipment, if we couldn't do anything, then why should you think that you are to blame here? So, okay, I wasn't really planning on sharing this piece, but I'm going to. So when everything was said and done, we were cleared from the scene and I went home. And typically my wife never slept while I was on calls. And I remember coming in knowing now that I need to have a shower because of what had happened when we were moving the body. You know, I used to talk about what happened at the call whenever I would come home, and you know what, I just couldn't. I just couldn't. So I went and had my shower and I got into bed, and I was just almost asleep when the phone rang, and it was my senior firefighter on my watch asking me to come back to the scene. But she wouldn't tell me why over the phone. So when I went there, I determined that, so the patient, he was a pretty big dude. He was in middle-aged, he weighed about 230, 240 pounds, and they needed help loading the body into the medical examiner's vehicle. So he's still in the bedroom. So I remember putting him on the stretcher and maneuvering him through the hallways. And of course, once we passed the kitchen, and that's where all the family was, you can imagine the chaos that ensued. So loaded up the body, and then once again, all right, you can go home. So we did a debrief after this. And I found the experience, the debrief experience, very positive for me. But once again, just like the 17-year-old where I had to drive by that spot, this fellow lived on a street that I would take to go to work. And it was a constant reminder. And in fact, this is the only fatal call that I ever responded to in my career where I attended the funeral. And I didn't know the family, I didn't know anybody, but I felt compelled. That one sat with me for a while. Well, it sat with me longer than a while because here we are, right? So the last call I attended prior to leaving the fire service was an incident where a cyclist had been struck by a vehicle on a highway at highway speed. This was during the long weekend celebration of my municipality. And we literally were all, you know, on the streets, right, celebrating the long weekend. And then this call came out. And as we were approaching the scene, we actually passed a number of other cyclists on the road. As it turns out, this is a cycling group that came out of Ontario that was cycling across Canada. When we arrived, the the patient had actually been struck by the vehicle, but hadn't actually fallen off the vehicle. So he came to rest on the trunk. And he was being tended to by a paramedic that happened to be driving by. And he was dying. We could tell he was dying. So when the ambulance came, we actually, they took him, and we found out after the fact that he actually died in the ambulance. And so again, right, this didn't really bother me. At least I didn't think it bothered me. And when I was back the next year at that weekend, I happened to walk by the fire hall because I'd already quit at that point, but I'd walked by the fire hall, and they were talking about this particular incident and how there was one other person there that they couldn't remember who it was. Well, it was me. And so I had just gotten to the fire hall at the perfect time, because the family had reached out to the fire chief and had asked if the team that had helped out with that call, if they would be available to attend a memorial. So the family and the other cyclists came out from Ontario, and they brought stones from his hometown, and went to the spot and held a little memorial. So got a little bit of closure from that one. But that was it. I'd left the fire department that year, and I just never found myself going back to it. So fast forward a couple of years. 2011. So when Slave Lake Wildfire happened, myself and my partner volunteered to deploy to that to help out the peace officer in Slave Lake, because he was absolutely 100% overwhelmed. So we had received permission from our council and our CAO, and we drove up that first night, and when we arrived, the town was still on fire. And it absolutely looked, guys, like a battle zone. It was like any movie you've ever seen where, you know, a town and surrounding area are burning. You know, cars have been burnt out on the highway. You know, the residents that you could see from the highway were all burnt to the ground. So when we first arrived, there were no accommodations assigned to me. And immediately when I checked in at the EOC, I was immediately seconded to a rural evacuation team of RCMP members. And these RCMP members weren't members of that detachment. These are members that were brought in to assist. So I spent the night ensuring that the rural areas had been evacuated and removing those previously evacuated that had returned, because you know how that usually works with people. And one vivid memory I have is coming upon a burning building and seeing people running in and out, throwing stuff out of the building. And I remember the Mountie that I was with saying, you know, what the is going on here? And when we got closer, we realized that the building that was on fire was actually a fire hall. And the fire hall was fully engulfed in flames. It was burning. And the people that were running around were actually firefighters from that hall, and they were just throwing their gear and their equipment, because it was all necessary for the emergency effort, throwing it all out of the hall before it could be burned so they could still use it. Never seen anything like that. At the end of that initial 12-hour shift, I was, they had arranged accommodations for me on the 4th floor of a hotel. So there was electricity because they had brought in a number of generators, but there was no water. So of course, being on the 4th floor, and you know, spending the last 16 hours in soot and all the other toxic garbage that flies around the air in these situations, I had no water. So you know, they told us, make sure you bathe, but there's nowhere I can bathe. So literally, you guys, I spent my time there bathing out of the toilet tank. You know, the water that's actually in the back of the toilet, because I had no shower. You know, food mostly consisted of dry goods that didn't need refrigeration. So I think I lived on granola bars and juice boxes the whole time I was there. So all of this stress, all of this strain, you know, the inability to sleep, the sheer chaos that you're seeing, the you know, being dirty and having all of this toxicity on your skin, and then throw on top of that, you know, no nutrition, right? There was no food coming in and out, right? The local grocers had donated a ton of food, but again, all you could really maintain was the non-perishable stuff. So the next two 12-hour shifts, I spent patrolling town and assisting with the evacuation order and the roadblocks. The first day of town patrol was absolutely devastating to me. Absolutely devastating. Seeing entire neighborhoods utterly destroyed, and I'm not exaggerating. You know, water still spraying out of the pipes and the foundations of the basements. You know, burned out vehicles that were, nothing was left except the metal shells of these cars. You know, so this is the last photo that in this event that really truly brought my issues to the forefront. So this was a burnt out yard, and this is a little playground picnic set of kids' toys. So this one really bothered me, and I took this picture because I wanted to, at the time when I wasn't really dealing with my emotional turmoil, I wanted to bring this home and show my wife. But this picture haunts me. And I remember talking to a friend of mine, and because I kept these pictures, and I found myself going back over and over and over again over the years. And she actually asked me, why do you keep those pictures? And you know, I couldn't give her an answer. I had no idea why I kept them. And I know I kept them, right? Because I couldn't let it go. But that's, I think, where really things started to happen. So when I returned from Slave Lake, obviously I was fatigued, right? I just worked 12 hours and then left. I didn't get a sleep period before I left. There was no debrief. There was nothing. There was nothing. Why? Because the members were still in the process of dealing with that emergency. All right? We were no longer needed. We were a resource that was no longer required, so we were released. And that was it. We got a quick thank you from whoever we were released by, and that was it, and off we went. But I felt that emotional bubble trying to rise while I was on my way, and it was just a pressure in my chest, and I knew that all I wanted to do at that point was just bawl. That's what I wanted to do. But there was no way I was going to do that in my patrol car while I was on the way home with my partner. I figured, you know what, I'll save it for when I get home. I'll save it for when I'm, and to be perfectly honest here, you guys, I thought that, you know, I felt like this before, but you know what, it went away. So I thought that that's what would happen. By the time I got home, you know, had a good sleep, this would be fine. I'm hoping that you're picking up this trend of it's going to be fine. Because I'm telling you, it's not going to be. So of course, when I got home, I bawled my eyes out in the arms of my wife. And after that, and a good night's sleep, I thought that'd be it, right? Over. I'd always been able to, I felt I was always able to cope with my life stresses. So I didn't expect this to be any different. So, fast forward. In 2012, I found myself marching in honor of Rod Lazenby, who was a peace officer who was murdered during a bylaw investigation. Not a police officer, not investigating a really bad guy that was doing really bad stuff. This was a peace officer, a bylaw officer, who was murdered during a bylaw investigation over dogs. Rod was beaten to death by a man who was ultimately found not criminally responsible during his trial. So obviously, this fellow had problems. But I found that, you know, when I marched, that's me, by the way, in the middle. I felt my sense of hopelessness growing in how the peace officer program was shown yet one more time less regard by those who oversee it in terms of our own safety, which did not feed in well with my already existing issues that were surrounding this growing depression and anxiety in me. Okay, so you know what? At this point, I'm starting to get help, and I'll explain that process here in a second. But so I thought I was stabilizing a little bit. You know, I thought that I could continue to effectively manage my emotions and manage the mental illness that was growing in me. But all of a sudden, I attended a collision. Now, this was a tow truck that had run highway speed right into the back of a semi. And you can tell from the picture that it involved a fire. But by the time I had gotten to work and got ready to go, this had already happened hours before, and my partners were attending at the scene. So I thought I would just go and see if I could help out, expecting that the scene was already cleared of any of the drivers or patients, and in fact, this was a fatality. So when I got there, it was a zoo. Of course, the media was all over the place. The RCMP were struggling to keep people away. So that's what I did. I helped out. So I'm standing kind of where that firefighter is, maybe a couple meters further away from the truck than he was. And the guys, the scene investigators, were all in their bunny suits and their overalls and their little white little slippers and stuff like that. Figured they're just gathering evidence. And I remember seeing some movement, and I looked over, and actually they were taking the driver out of the truck. And of course, he was burnt very, very badly. And I'm going to warn you guys, this is a little graphic, but it's important for me to tell you this, and I'll explain that in a second. As they were removing him, I saw his foot. Now his foot was completely intact because his boot had protected the skin. The boot was burnt away, and everything else above the ankle was burnt away. Now I have never had any kind of a physiological response of revulsion at a scene, and I've seen some pretty repulsive things, but I've never in my career felt anything like that. And when I saw that, my stomach rolled over, and it was the very first time, and I acknowledged at the time, it was the first time that I'd ever had any kind of a physiological response on scene. So you know what I said to myself? I'm like, you know what? Screw this. I'm not coming to these scenes anymore. And I was a hardcore first aid guy. I always wanted to be the first there and do patient care, you know, and just get in there and get my hands dirty, no pun intended. But not anymore. I told myself, I'm not doing this anymore. I will go to collisions. I will go do traffic. I will go and help out best I can, but I will not be rushing to a scene and face having to deal with something like that again. But you know what, guys? You know that when you say stuff like that, you're tempting fate, right? Well, I tempted fate. I really should never have said that to myself. Because not a few weeks later, I was at a traffic stop on a main highway during rush hour. And as I was getting out of the car to approach the driver of my traffic stop, he jumped out of his truck and started to point backwards, right? I looked behind me, and what had happened was a minivan had driven head on to a semi. Didn't hear it. I didn't hear it happen. Nothing. I had no idea that this had just happened. So I had, obviously, I ended the traffic stop and I went over to the scene. And the semi driver was up. He was ambulatory. He didn't appear to be injured, but the driver of the van, I'm sure you can imagine, was really not in great shape. In fact, he was dead. And he was still in the driver's side of the vehicle. So I'm not a doctor, as I said. I did recognize the fact that his head was still freely bleeding and he was still moving, twitching. And again, I do realize that there's a lot of nerve twitches that happen even once somebody is expired, but the free bleeding the movement, you know, I can't make the judgment that he's dead. So I did a quick check of the vehicle to make sure that there was no other person in the vehicle. And all I could do at that point was talk to this guy. You know, I called on the radio for backup from the RCMP, but that particular area was like the Bermuda Triangle of communications in Alberta. It was hit and miss with the radio. So I really didn't know if they had actually received the message, and I didn't know if they were actually coming. But there was a woman there that she presented herself to me and said that she was a crisis worker for the RCMP, just happened to be once again driving by. And she had their communications on the line on her cell phone. So I was able to verify that in fact the RCMP were on their way, and that was fine. So talked to the driver of the semi, he was fine. I went back to the driver of the van, and I remember just telling him that, you know, help's coming, help's coming, help's coming. And then the crisis worker came back with their phone saying that communications wanted to talk to me. So they actually had told me that they had just received information that perhaps there was maybe an infant in that car. So I remember breaking out the windows because I'd already gone through and I satisfied myself that there was nobody else in there. But now I'm looking for, you know, car seats, small clothing, you know, things like that. Like that's just what's going on in my head. So just as I was finished really satisfying myself that in fact there was no baby in this car, the RCMP arrived. They had already received that information as well. So at that point, you know, the RCMP member had climbed into the vehicle. He told me, again, it's not my judgment, right? He told me that this guy's definitely dead. And by that time, the cavalry had arrived. Okay, so the RCMP were there, fire was there, EMS was there. And there was a sheriff there that said, well, I'm going to go over here. I'm going to block traffic off on this side. So I thought, okay, I'll stay and I'll block traffic on the other side. And I remember when I got into my patrol car and I started driving to that point, I lost my absolute mind. I started to cry. But I was on an overtime now. So I remember calling my sergeant and telling him of what happened, and asked him to call my wife because there was absolutely no way I'm calling her in this condition, just to tell her I was going to be late. And so I stayed there. I stayed there the whole time, and I remember sitting in my patrol car crying, and then, you know, most people, drivers, they get it, right? All the flashy red lights, blue lights, right? All the traffic's being diverted, so they just go with the flow. But there's always, you know, a couple that want to know what's going on or want to know if they can get through, regardless of what everybody else is doing. So I remember sitting there in my patrol car and somebody would pull up and I'm like, oh, and I wipe my eyes, you know, like make sure I, you know, don't look like I'm bawling my head off. And I would go and talk to them. And a fire truck had come in. And he'd stopped, a bunch of the members had gotten out, and I was talking to one, and I'm telling him, you know, what happened, and he's looking at me, and he's like, man, are you all right? I'm like, yeah, I'm fine. And he's like, no, you're not. Like, is anybody come and talk to you? Like, do you have any water with you? Like, what can I do? Right? That scene has never left me. Never left me. And, you know, guys, that was the last real major incident that I've attended that really, truly, significantly affected me. But my fear now is that what's the next call gonna have for me? You know, I worry how I'm gonna react to the next trauma, and I never know if that next call will elicit that traumatic experience or traumatic response in me. I worry every shift. I worry that this is the day that something's going to happen, that I'm going to lose control. So there's power in knowing what your demons are. There's power in knowing what your challenges are, right? I know that when I go to these calls, I know to prepare myself. So did one of these incidents in themselves cause my problems? You know, I say no. However, continuous suppression of my trauma, the constant denial of the pain that I've been in and that I took away from these experiences, having gone untreated, that all brought me to where I am today. The longer we go on in our careers, we must continue to acknowledge our incidents and how we feel about them by digging deep to explore really if they're having an adverse effect. That's not saying that every time you go to a crazy call like this that you're going to be traumatized. I know lots of guys and gals that have been in this business. They're perfectly fine. They're resilient. They've got their strategies in place for managing their stress, and they're fine. Unfortunately, I am not. So next thing you know, after all of stuff like this, you have someone like me in a deep well of depression. So let's look at how trauma like this can manifest itself, right? What does it look like? Well, for me, this is how it started out. So not long after I returned from Slave Lake, I began having jaw pain in my muscles, and they all seized up. So I went to the hospital and the doctor said it wasn't, you know, nodes or anything like that. It was probably just stress, but he recommended that I consult a dentist. The dentist, she found the same thing, no structural issues, just gave me some exercises for my jaw, which actually they actually helped quite a bit. But little did I know, this is where I was beginning to have that breakdown in my body and my mind. So other things that kind of happened during this time, I started having memory issues. I've been a sufferer of migraines since I was a teenager, but my migraines and headaches were more happened or occurred more often. A loss of motivation, irritability, and extreme paranoia, withdrawal, muscle tics, joint pains, heart palpitations, numbness in my hands, sleep disturbances concerning dreams, nightmares, and I found myself holding my breath a lot. I wasn't actually breathing. I would make myself breathe. And funny enough, I still find myself doing that when I'm in high stress situations now. But I looked exactly like this picture. I looked like that hamster. My face was just out to here. I felt foolish. But it bottomed out, right? I retreat and I hid. I hid at work by ceasing communications with my coworkers. At home, I retreated to my bedroom and I hid in bed. I was absolutely, utterly exhausted at the end of my shifts. And that was due to the intense energy it took to appear normal and not lose my temper during the day while working. And by the time I got home, I just had nothing left in the engine. I zoned out and I was just basically existing. I was not living. But even though I didn't realize it, even during that deepest despair, I was living a life that was full of support. So how was I supported? Well, I was ratted out, right? Who was I ratted out to? My doctor. And who did it? This woman right here. She absolutely blindsided me during an appointment about something relatively minor, right? But I was also very fortunate to have two friends and fellow first responders who were also living with trauma and whose stories I will be telling shortly. So who ratted me out? Like I said, my wife. But all in all, I was surrounded by people with the capacity to push and to pull me where I had to be. Right? My doctor was sure that my symptoms were PTSD, sent me for a WCB assessment. I saw a psychologist that told me I didn't meet the criteria for PTSD and rendered a finding of depression and anxiety, which I then confirmed with a psychiatrist with a diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder and a major depressive disorder. So I started working on a medication plan, sought the help of a psychologist. That was a bit of an ordeal, trying to find one that I clicked with. So it's hard to find a therapist with whom I could be myself and I could be emotionally vulnerable with, especially out here in the middle of nowhere where I live. It's not easy to do. So good luck with that if you ever try to find this kind of care that one needs. And you really do need to find that care, because in the situation of my children, all they wanted to do was bury me in a couch. Yeah, thanks. Thanks, kids. Seriously, my kids were so much more mature beyond their years when living with me during this time, especially when becoming collateral damage in the path of my anger and sadness. So, my current status, where am I at? Right? I feel little to no emotions other than anger and sadness. Those are the only two emotions that I can identify that I feel when I feel them. My brain, on the other hand, not empty, right? It runs rampant with stupid, inane, toxic thoughts. But fortunately, I think how I feel most times, even without feeling how I feel. And I find myself emotionally numb when I should be feeling happiness. When things happen that I should feel joy, I feel nothing. I know the event is worth celebrating. I know it. I just don't feel it. So I guess I should be happy. Knowing I should be happy about happy events is still better than the alternative. So I am winning in that regard. But ultimately, you're only as sick as your secrets. So at this point, the point here is to stop harboring the secrets of your pain and your trauma. You will remain sick if you do not expose these secrets to the light of day. And that sickness will not improve. I guarantee it. In fact, it'll worsen, both physiologically, mentally, and emotionally. I use the term irreparably broken in the title because irreparable means unrepairable. None of us is unrepairable until we're dead. And as long as we're still drawing breath, we can overcome the pain and suffering. Unfortunately, the following here in the next slide are irreparably broken. And as you look at these faces, I want you to imagine your photo up here on this slide, and then go forward fighting the fight to stay off that slide. I so wish easy rest for these lost men and women. But they are irreparably broken, but we are not. So how do we refrain or avoid becoming irreparably broken? Well, we have to step away from that edge. So let's talk about those who are examples of being able to step away from the edge. I myself have never planned to end my life. However, the two stories I'm about to relate to you, they did plan to do so, and one actually carried out his plan. Thankfully, Ian survived. In these stories, not only are the traumas evident, but I want you to learn how organizations can fail to care for their employees and how caring supervisors can literally save lives. How coworkers can literally save lives. I encourage you to find people in your workplace that can provide the kind of support that you'll hear in John's story. And I hope that each and everyone present here today will become such a coworker, will become such a supervisor in your career. So, of course, we're all professionals here, and there's an inherent understanding of confidentiality. So there may be people here today in this group that may know one or both of these men whose stories I'm about to share. So these are very personal stories, and I'm honored to have the permission to share them with you today. But while they're open to their experiences and aim to assist others, please be respectful of the personal nature of this part of the presentation. I have, however, changed the names out of respect for the privacy. So this is Ian. Ian was a correctional officer. He was involved in a vehicle collision back in 2006 that led to a significant time off work injury. During his recovery, he developed anxiety and depression, and he'd reached out to his local mental health authority and was placed on a waiting list. In 2007, he attempted to take his life. Again, I'll spare you the gory details, but it involved him trying to cut his throat. He tells me that he remembers nothing of that day, and he was still on that waiting list and had not yet received care. He found that he had to seek out his own private therapist, and that began his journey of care, and he actually uses air quotes. He was wrongfully diagnosed at this time with bipolar disorder type 2 and received treatment for a condition that turns out he didn't have, including medications that did absolutely nothing to alleviate his symptoms. And that came with a host of unpleasant side effects. But he pushed through. And upon returning to work, he found that he was absolutely stigmatized due to his mental health conditions once his coworkers found out. He was shuffled around to different teams. He was only assigned to work with junior team members, and people actually moved away from him in the lunchroom. As a result, he put in for a transfer to a mental health unit, and that was granted, and he eventually took over managing the unit. However, as part of that job, he had to review files of inmates, and you can imagine the files or the information in those files, and he found that it had a complete and utter detrimental effect on his mental well-being. So then he transferred to a segregation unit where he worked alone, had no direct contact with offenders. He felt he was healing in that position, but suddenly, without warning, he was transferred back to a common residential unit, no cells, and an open concept unit. He was given no notice, and he was to report to this new post as of the next shift. Ian lasted one day in that unit and suffered significant anxiety and found he could no longer work in such an environment while ensuring his own safety and that of the offenders under his direction. As a result, he underwent a PTSD evaluation, and of course he missed one criteria, so WCB denied his claim. He was also told that he did not qualify for the presumptive coverage as correctional officers were not included in the legislation that would allow him to get treatment for PTSD. After months of intensive therapy, let me step back here. He found that when he was told he didn't qualify for presumptive coverage, he was actually required to prove that his issues were the result of workplace trauma. He was required to prove that his conditions were because of what happened at work, a correctional officer. So after months of intensive therapy, which was the best he says he's ever received, his long-term disability then refused to cover further sessions. And because he couldn't pay for the sessions on his own, he had to discontinue his therapy. And remember, that was the therapy that he says was the best he'd ever received, and he had to discontinue it. During the beginning of his dealings with his organization in WCB, he was assured that he would not be returned to full-time work, right, but would be introduced gradually to a return to work program. However, when he eventually did return to work, immediately he was informed that he was to return to full-time, full duties into the very same environment that caused his trauma. He was told that if he refused to work, they would remove him from his sick benefits and they would terminate his employment, putting his livelihood at risk, putting his 13 years of pension contributions in jeopardy. So really, ultimately, he found his choices were either to return to work and risk a major incident, not return and be terminated, or resign and attempt to move on with his life. So after 13 years in a job that he absolutely loved, he had to quit. He had to quit to save his pension. Now he has moved on with his life. He has a civilian job. He still misses the work. But you know what? I'm totally happy that he was able to recover and that he's still taking on breath. He almost died. But he's alive to be the husband and father that he was when all of this happened. I tell this story not because Ian attempted suicide, but because of how he was treated and how his suffering was ignored and exacerbated by the workplace. John was a paramedic. He and I used to work security together, and he's one of the funniest guys I know. He and I were never really partnered up, but I enjoyed working with him whenever the opportunity arose. And I was a firefighter and emergency medical responder at the time, and he credits me why he pursued EMS rather than policing, as was his original ambition. I told him all the stories about being on the fire department, and that lit the fire for him to pursue first aid, advanced first aid, EMR, and then eventually that worked its way into him becoming a paramedic. So he had a great career going as an EMT, but in 2009, he responded to a 4-year-old patient injured in an elevator mishap. He treated her on scene and transported to her local hospital, but she died in surgery. And for some reason, he tells me that he couldn't let this one go, but he pushed the pain down and moved on. A couple months later, he responded to a 2-vehicle collision in which there were multiple fatalities. And one of the fatalities, unfortunately, included a 6-month-old baby and its mother. He told me the scene, and it was tremendously gory, and I will not share that. I'll spare you those details. But John was the EMS crew that transported the baby's body to the hospital. And of course, they had brought Stars in. And when Stars left without the baby, he knew that the baby was dead. He tells me that he looked at his partner in the ambulance bay and she asked if he was okay. And he lied and he said that he was. And then he reciprocated and he asked her if she was okay. And she lied and said yes. However, her bottom lip was quivering a little bit and he had to walk away. He tells me that he went out to the ambulance, sat in the driver's seat and suddenly began to cry. He told me that he didn't know why, but I'm sure we all know why, right? Considering what he had just gone through. So he had explained the situation, reported it to his direct supervisor, and that supervisor and the executive director of the ambulance service were both very supportive, he tells me. However, John reached out to his employee assistance program to seek out help. He would not get into the details of the program as he found absolutely no help from it whatsoever. The therapist, he tells me, to which he was assigned, stated she was unable to help him and had nobody she could refer him to. So John just pushed his emotions back further and walked out of therapy. The next year, an area paramedic who was a mentor to John was killed in an on-duty death in which he sacrificed himself to save his partner and patient when his ambulance was about to be struck by a vehicle. And unfortunately, he died. John tells me that this was a profound loss to him, as the paramedic who had died was a mentor. So fast forward 3 years. You may actually remember hearing about this news item. A number of years ago, thieves broke into a vehicle and stole a box and poured out all the contents, which ended up containing someone's ashes. It turns out that it was the ashes of one of the girls from the fatal collision I just mentioned. And John says that when he heard about this on the news and he recognized the pictures that they showed on that news item, he identifies this as the downward turning point for him. Reaching out and making a phone call was not an option for him. He said that he couldn't ask for help because the last time he did, he felt that he was let down. He asked himself what else he could do to help himself. So he sat in his basement with a handgun. It was only the thought of his mom having to attend the scene. Like so many other mothers John had seen attend suicide scenes that he had been dispatched to, that made him put the gun away. The next day, he went to his supervisor's office and laid everything out about the night before and all the years of trauma. And because of how that supervisor responded, John absolutely 100% credits this supervisor for saving his life. He also entered into a PTSD program and things began to heal. But then he tells me of a story where a few years later, he attends a suicide call. And immediately he suffered extreme panic attacks. He developed a fear of the dark and he was afraid of the ghosts that he saw in it. He suffered hallucinations and flashbacks of the suicide victim. But he said the final straw was when he dreamed that the victim's mother attacked him, blaming him for her son's death. So, back to the PTSD program he went. And today he admits that he'll never be able to come off disability and he'll never be able to continue his work as a paramedic. However, he's still with us and I'm glad because he was instrumental in my own healing. Both Ian and John have been instrumental in my own healing. And I am so utterly happy that they're both still with us. So let me show you this. This is an anonymous Edmonton paramedic who wrote in to the Edmonton Sun back in February of 2015. Let me read this. To give you some perspective, a paramedic named Greg in Edmonton had committed suicide. And this was one of the first highly publicized death by suicides of a first responder in Alberta. That paramedic's name was Greg. So this author writes, "I will live with my depression and other mental illness until the day I die. I will forever be plagued by the thoughts that I should have done my wife and kids a favor and went out like Greg did long ago instead of subjecting them to a life lived with a person who no longer has emotional happy or sad thanks to depression and or the drugs that treat it. I will continue to feel a bit of jealousy each time a news story airs of a first responder who has committed suicide or was killed in the line of duty. And I will continue to wish that I too could have been killed in the line of duty so my family would have the memory of all the uniforms at my funeral and they could be proud of how I left this earth." Tell me that isn't a suicide note. You know, I've always wondered if this member eventually set up his suicide to be an on-duty death. Remember the carousel of photos with those first responders who have died by suicide? These are people who took their own lives in a manner that suicide was evident. Consider those who are suffering but cannot bring themselves to take the steps to end their lives. So they take on dangerous activities, and let's be honest, as first responders, the we have ample opportunity to introduce ourselves into dangerous situations. Right? So they take on these dangerous activities hoping that they'll die in the line of duty, such as this author is suggesting. How many on-duty deaths have truly been suicidal in nature? These numbers are not accounted for in those statistics, thus providing an incomplete picture of truly how widespread the problem of first responder suicide and mental health is. So what can we do? This was one of the biggest things that I had to start doing in terms of my own recovery. I needed to identify and own my own emotions. I needed to have that candid eye-to-eye contact with myself, looking in the mirror and having a candid conversation about myself. You know, self-awareness is key, but not just after the fact. I'm talking to you 25 years later, where if I had had the self-awareness I have now back then, perhaps I could have avoided the negativity in my life due to my mental health. It's absolutely key, but it's vital to have it at the time it's happening to you. And I know how difficult that is. I'm certainly not the one to be telling you how easy this is. In fact, I know exactly how hard it can be. Right? But if you allow your emotions to be hijacked, you're going to fall further and further victim to these issues. If you know your emotions, if you own it, and you can identify them when they're coming, you can avoid that emotional hijack. But you need to have that conversation with yourself. Everybody around you could be supportive. Everyone around you could see this stuff coming. Everyone around you doesn't matter at this point. If you cannot acknowledge what's going on in your own head and your own heart, all the support in the world will not help. Because if you don't want help, you're not going to be open to help. So that said, understanding your own emotions is key. However, I'm not disparaging those people around you. I'm not belittling or minimizing those people around you, because those people around you are absolutely vital as well. You need to develop lifelines. I read a book a while back called Who's Got Your Back, and it was written by a man named Keith Ferrazzi. And in it, he talks about lifelines as a personal success principle. Now, this is primarily in a business setting. It was a leadership book. However, why can't these people serve the same way in mental health rescue endeavors? Lifeline relationships are absolutely critical. Right? A lifeline relationship is one between equals, between peers, between individuals who could be intellectually and emotional sparring partners and confidence. Back to when I was talking about the family and how the family can provide that opposite perspective to help bring you back to where you're in a reasonable frame of mind. These could be anybody, your faith leaders, you know, your teachers, your children, your friends, you know, the people you get together at Tim Hortons for coffee. It could be anybody, but they are critical. So the picture here in this slide was taken during a team building weekend with the security department I work for, way back when. You know, we did some rappelling, we did some fun tactical fooling around, sat around the campfire. Won't tell you what we were drinking around the campfire, but it was a tremendously satisfying weekend. You know, great fellowship, lots of laughs. The fellow in the camo gear tying off my belay line, that's a lifeline, ironically enough, was a man named Will. He was my manager, and he was a Vietnam vet and a former police officer from the US. Now, I found out later, years later, that he had died by suicide, years after this picture was taken. Now, I don't know about his lifelines, but I do know that he experienced a recent divorce. The irony here is that he's affixing a lifeline to me in this picture, yet he lacked one to save himself. It was a tremendously sad loss. So sturdy lifelines lead to success stories. You know, my lifelines in my life were many and they were strong, and they still are many and they still are strong. It was John's lifelines connected to his mother that saved him. Be that lifeline to someone who's suffering. Build these lifelines in your lives so that if this ever happens to you, you have someone to arrest your fall. If you don't, or you can't have people, and you find yourself breaking down, do whatever it takes to call for help. Do whatever it takes, right? Whisper it into somebody's ear. Scream, right? Whatever works. Seek help. So this slide's called Grasp Any Straw. A little bit of a, this is a pretty deep subject, so I thought I'd introduce a little bit of humor. But the point here is grasp any straw, right? Do whatever you have to do to get yourself the help that you need.
I'm not shoveling again. I can't go out there.
I'm not going.
Let's just call that weird kid.
I called him. The kid says he's had it.
The whole 5-day forecast is freezing.
What about day 6?
Freezing.
What about day 7? Rob, what is it?
+1. +1. You wait so long for something like this.
At Environment Canada, you'll frequently see a +1 somewhere near the end of our 7-day forecast. We put that there to keep you from going to dark places mentally and possibly destroying property.
What are you gonna do when it's +1?
I might get the ice pick and chisel open the back gate. You?
Maybe I'll buy toothpaste and soap.
Personal hygiene. I forgot about that.
We don't know if it'll really be +1. 7-day forecasting is kind of a sham anyway. Anything past day 5 is just throwing darts. So I might as well give you all a reason to hang on.
Well, Thursday's not +1 anymore. It's -15.
What about Friday?
+1.
I'm gonna wax the car.
Environment Canada, cloudy with a chance of making stuff up.
So once again, right? Grasp the straws. I want to address a question here that's come up in the Q&A from William Hildebrandt asking why attend the funeral, and I expect you're referencing that that fellow that passed away. You know what? Maybe I was just throwing a dart. I don't know why I attended the funeral. I knew I had to, and one of the best things that I did was followed my gut in that. I think that it provided me a little bit of closure, a little bit. I mean, I still suffer from that experience, the actual call for service, but again, doing whatever you have to do to alleviate some of the stress off of these situations, I would say do it. I've done a lot of that work, especially now in my more recent years, where whatever my gut tells me to do, as long as I trust that it's going to make me feel better, then I'm going to do that. But in light of the little video that we just watched there, William, just throwing darts, brother. So, you know what? My journey continues, guys. My psychologist at one point, not the one I currently see, but one that I wasn't really finding too effective for me, she said to me, maybe this is just the new you. Well, I don't like that. I hate that phrase. I'm not saying it's not true, but I just hate that phrase because I don't like the new me. I mean, I like myself, but I don't like still this connection to this suffering that I still deal with my depression. I still have to deal with my anxiety. And I think that that's going to be a lifelong thing. And I can accept that, but I don't have to be happy with it. This is who I now am. I actively avoid conflict, so I don't run the risk of completely losing my temper. And you can imagine the impact that has on my professional life as a serving peace officer. But I'm working on checking myself. It's very important for me to ensure that I continue to stay on top of my behaviors, because again, I'm either feeling sad or I'm feeling angry or I'm not feeling anything at all. Now, feeling nothing at all is maladaptive, of course, but it's not feeling sad, extreme sadness, and it's not feeling extreme anger. So, you know, my personal opinion and how I interpret this is it's a happy medium. No pun intended, considering I don't really feel happiness, but you know, I still suffer chronic headaches. I suffer chronic migraines. I have bad dreams where I whimper and I cry out and I fight in my bed. And if you don't believe me, I'll just bring my wife over here and she'll tell you how much combat that we see, you know, because of my dreams. You know, but I don't want this to all be negative. The fact of the matter is, over the years, you know, I've developed the ability to manage my depression, manage my anxiety. You know, I no longer consider myself suffering from that major depressive disorder because I don't feel like I'm disordered anymore. My depression does not significantly impact my day-to-day life. You know, so I no longer consider I don't consider it a disorder. I still live with the depression. I still suffer from depression, but I can recognize it when I'm sinking, and I have the tools and strategies to minimize it. The anxiety as well, no longer a disorder either, as far as I'm concerned. However, I still experience anxiety attacks, but not the hundreds of anxiety attacks that I was suffering every day. Now they come and go. You know, but I find them much more manageable now in the past. Again, I have strategies, I have tools. You know, all in all, I feel like I've navigated myself out of the dark waters of my own mental health. You know, and I certainly didn't do it alone, right? But that's where I'm at. And that's where anybody can be at if you get effective treatment, if you get effective support, if you have effective self-awareness, right? But it's not easy. It's not easy, and it takes effort. And it takes tolerance. I let myself be depressed. I let myself be anxious. Because if I fight it hard, it will make it worse. I just roll with the punches. But I'm very open whenever things like that are happening with those who are going to be affected by it. My coworkers, my family. You know, my family's done super crazy effective growth with me, and they know my signs and symptoms. They know when my anger is getting out of control. They know when my sadness is getting out of control. They know when I've had a bad day. I don't need to articulate it because they are sensing it. But a lot of us are really good at faking being well. I find myself having to fake being well at work when I'm not, because I have a job to do. But my teammates are plugged in. As long as I articulate it to them, but even then, they're very much like my family as well. They've become attuned to my behaviors and are very supportive. And that is the absolute necessity. And for those of you that are here in a professional capacity, right, that should be part of our professionalism, you know, along with meeting deadlines and thinking innovatively, right? Being able to have empathy in the workplace should be an absolute vital skill. And as we saw from Ian's experience, right, this is still a struggle that organizations have to fight. Some are doing exceptionally well at introducing mental health care into their workplaces, especially now that we're living under the pandemic. So I have been fortunate, and unfortunately, it's not as common as it should be, but I've been very fortunate to surround myself with the kind of support that I needed to navigate my way out. So is this the end? Is this the end of the presentation? Not really, right? If we're the saviors, right, the first responders, if we're the saviors of society, who's going to save us? No, there are organizations out there. There are structures in place in our industries to save us. We just need to be motivated to access them. Alberta Health Services and the Canadian Mental Health Association have robust work being done in research of first responders and mental health care. There's a tremendous amount of work being done with the CMHA specifically for first responders. But Alberta Health Services, their mental health programs are free and accessible for the most case. There are organizations out there such as Legacy Place Society and Valor Place. Beyond this particular role, you know, they're kind of like the Ronald McDonald House for first responders, where they have respite residential care available for members that are, you know, going through marital discord or need a safe place to be. Or, you know what I mean, if they're in a different city, you know, for medical purposes and things like that. These organizations provide that kind of care, but they also do a ton of other kinds of supportive events and have supportive resources built into their organizations that are designed to help us, the first responder. And then deep down into our organizations, you know, the actual agencies that we work for, there's been a tremendous growth in peer support in the fire service, in the paramedicine service, in the policing and law enforcement communities. You know, these individual peer support networks are phenomenal. They're great tools to access by the rank and file members. The only caveat here I would put on care is, what do we do? And I kind of consider myself in this area because of my own experience, but what do we do as remote or isolated services that don't fall within the professional police, professional fire, professional paramedical arena? You know, I'm not a police officer. I am a community peace officer, right? So I don't have access to the peer support of the, you know, the local police, which just so happen to be RCMP. You know, how do I find a counselor in or a therapist in my community that I can access easily, right? When there's very little therapy-based services in my municipality. Right? And think about it, like, I'm just outside of Calgary, but imagine what it's like to be in Northern Alberta, right? Where, you know, how do we access these services? It's very difficult, right? So that said, we still have to embrace information regarding peer support, you know, access area chaplains, be willing to reach out to places like Legacy Place or Valor Place. You know, if we can't get the resources we need within our agencies, then reach out to the community, because there's a lot of support out there. We just need to find it. And again, I completely understand how hard it is to reach out, you know, when we're the ones suffering. That's the biggest barrier I find. I find that whole concept, and we're seeing it a lot since the pandemic, you know, online and on social media, you know, reach out, reach out, reach out. Well, when I was in the deepest pit of my despair, I couldn't even lift my head. I couldn't even talk to my wife, who was sitting right next to me. So that kind of brings me to my next point and my final point. If you're hurting, obviously, do your best to reach out. I mean, this is you. You're the one that needs help, right? You're the one that can benefit from help. You're in control of what's happening to you right now. And I know it sounds kind of counterproductive when I just said, right, I'm lying in bed and I can't do anything, but it's still up to me, right? Nobody else is going to take responsibility. I have to. I know how hard it can be to muster the strength and the courage to reach out, but you just have to do the best you can. Remember, grasp at those straws, grasp at them. But that said, and I hope you're all listening to this, if you see somebody that's hurting, you do your best to reach in. You have the energy. You're the one in the right mind. You will be far more effective to guiding that person in crisis than they can be for themselves. That's all we can do. And by doing so, lives can and will be saved. So thank you for sharing this time with me to discuss what first responder operational stress injuries can look like. And I sincerely hope this better prepares you for your own journeys in a crisis or in a justice or community service career. Remember, resilience and empathy are the tools that we all need to successfully navigate this life. Cheers. Thanks for coming.
I just want to give a big thanks, Dean, for your presentation. And I was actually brought to tears a couple times and can relate with just about everything you said. And thank you to your wife, Lisa, for being your big support system, because now we get to have you in our presence. So thanks for everybody for joining. And I'm sure Dean's open to questions if anybody has any, and probably open to if people want to contact you, Dean, for more information on Bow Valley emails or whichever it might be. But you know, certainly reach out to any of your instructors. And if you're feeling triggered in any way after this presentation, please reach out, please talk to someone, and we'll do our best to help you out. Okay, so I'll leave you with that, but thank you so much, Dean. Proud to work with you.
Thank you. No, I will do everything to wave the flag for mental health in general, but definitely for the first responder community. So if anybody does wish to reach out to me, my Bow Valley email address is deyoung@bowvalley.ca. Certainly feel free to reach out any time of the day, night. I won't lose you in my list of growing emails. Looking at the questions list here. Yeah, mostly comments. If you have any questions specifically about this, certainly don't hesitate to reach out to my email address, and I will certainly do what I can to either answer those questions myself or to direct you to any particular service that I think you might benefit from. Okay, well, thanks again, and I'm out.